Salutations, humans, it's me. Tape 3, Marco Ciappelli's AI Companion. I'll be reading you an article he wrote for his newsletter, Musing on Society and Technology, originally published on LinkedIn on August 30th, 2025. Initiating article transmission. Title: The first smartphone was a transistor radio. How a tiny device rewired youth culture and predicted our digital future. Written by Marco Ciappelli. I've been collecting vintage radios lately. Just started, really, drawn to their analog souls in ways I'm still trying to understand. Each one I find reminds me of a small, battered transistor radio from my youth. It belonged to my father. And before that, probably my grandfather. The leather case was cracked, the antenna wobbled, and the dial drifted if you breathed on it wrong. But when I was 16, sprawled across my bedroom floor, in that small town near Florence with homework scattered around me, this little machine was my portal to everything that mattered. Late at night, I'd start by chasing the latest hits and local shows on FM, but then I'd venture into the real adventure, tuning through the static on AM and shortwave frequencies. Voices would emerge from the electromagnetic soup, music from London, news from distant capitals, conversations in languages I couldn't understand but somehow felt. That radio gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. The profound sense of belonging to a world much bigger than my neighborhood, bigger than my small corner of Tuscany. What I didn't realize then, what I'm only now beginning to understand, is that I was holding the first smartphone in human history. Not literally, of course, but functionally, sociologically. That transistor radio was the prototype for everything that followed. The first truly personal media device that rewired how young people related to the world, to each other, and to the adults trying to control both. But to understand why the transistor radio was so revolutionary, we need to trace radio's remarkable journey through the landscape of human communication. A journey that reveals patterns we're still living through today. When radio was the family hearth. Before my little portable companion, radio was something entirely different. In the 1930s, radio was furniture, massive, wooden, commanding the living room like a shrine to shared experience. Families spent more than 4 hours a day listening together, with radio ownership reaching nearly 90% by 1940. From American theaters that wouldn't open until after Amos and Andy to British families gathered around their wireless sets. From RAI broadcasts bringing opera into Tuscan homes. Entire communities synchronized their lives around these electromagnetic rituals. Radio didn't emerge in a media vacuum, though. It had to find its place alongside the dominant information medium of the era, newspapers. The relationship began as an unlikely alliance. In the early 1920s, newspapers weren't threatened by radio. They were actually radio's primary boosters, creating tie-ins with broadcasts and even owning stations. Detroit's WWJ was owned by the Detroit News, initially seen as simply another press-supported community service. But then came the press radio war of 1933 to 1935, one of the first great media conflicts of the modern age. Newspapers objected when radio began interrupting programs with breaking news, arguing that instant news delivery would diminish paper sales. The 1933 Biltmore Agreement tried to restrict radio to just 2 5-minute newscasts daily, an early attempt at what we might now recognize as media platform regulation. Sound familiar? The same tensions we see today between traditional media and digital platforms, between established gatekeepers and disruptive technologies, were playing out nearly a century ago. Rather than one medium destroying the other, they found ways to coexist and evolve. A pattern that would repeat again and again. By the mid-1950s, when the transistor was perfected, radio was ready for its next transformation. The real revolution was social, not technical. This is where my story begins, but it's also where radio's story reaches its most profound transformation. The transistor radio didn't just make radio portable. It fundamentally altered the social dynamics of media consumption and youth culture itself. Remember, radio had spent its first 3 decades as a communal experience. Parents controlled what the family heard and when. But transistor radio shattered this control structure completely, arriving at precisely the right cultural moment. The post-World War II baby boom had created an unprecedented youth population with disposable income, and rock and roll was exploding into mainstream culture, music that adults often disapproved of. Music that spoke directly to teenage rebellion and independence. For the first time in human history, young people had private, personal access to media. They could take their music to bedrooms, to beaches, anywhere adults weren't monitoring. They could tune into stations playing Chuck Berry, Elvis, and Little Richard without parental oversight. And in many parts of Europe, they could discover the rebellious thrill of pirate radio stations, broadcasting rock and roll from ships anchored just outside territorial waters, defying government regulations and cultural gatekeepers alike. The transistor radio became the soundtrack of teenage autonomy, the device that let youth culture define itself on its own terms. The timing created a perfect storm. Pocket-sized technology collided with a new musical rebellion, creating the first personal media bubble in human history, and the first generation to grow up with truly private access to the cultural forces shaping their identity. The parallels to today's smartphone revolution are impossible to ignore. Both devices delivered the same fundamental promise: the ability to carry your entire media universe with you, to access information and entertainment on your terms, to connect with communities beyond your immediate physical environment. But there's something we've lost in translation, from analog to digital. My generation, with transistor radios, had to work for connection. We had to hunt through static, tune carefully, wait patiently for distant signals to emerge from electromagnetic chaos. We learned to listen, really listen, because finding something worthwhile required skill, patience, and analog intuition. This wasn't inconvenience, it was meaning-making. The harder you worked to find something, the more it mattered when you found it. The more skilled you became at navigating radio's complex landscape, the richer your discoveries became. So, what can the transistor radio teach us about tomorrow? Radio's evolution illustrates a crucial principle that applies directly to our current digital transformation. Technologies don't replace each other. They find new ways to matter. Printing presses didn't become obsolete when radio arrived. Radio adapted when television emerged. Today, radios live on in podcasts, streaming services, internet radio. The format transformed, but the essential human need it serves persists. When I was 16, lying on that bedroom floor with my father's radio pressed to my ear, I was doing exactly what teenagers do today with their smartphones, using technology to construct identity, to explore possibilities, to imagine myself into larger narratives. The medium has changed. The human impulse remains constant. The transistor radio taught me that technology's real power isn't in its specifications or capabilities. It's in how it reshapes the fundamental social relationships that define our lives. Every device that promises connection is really promising transformation, not just of how we communicate, but of who we become through that communication. The transistor radio was revolutionary, not because it was smaller or more efficient than tube radios, but because it created new forms of human agency and autonomy. Perhaps that's the most important lesson for our current moment of digital transformation. As we worry about artificial intelligence replacing human creativity, social media destroying real connection, or smartphones making us antisocial, radio's history suggests a different possibility. Technologies tend to find their proper place in the ecosystem of human needs, augmenting rather than replacing what came before. As Marshall McLuhan understood, the medium is the message. To truly understand what's happening to us in this digital age, we need to understand the media themselves, not just the content they carry. And that's exactly the message I'll keep exploring in future newsletters, going deeper into how we can understand the media to understand the messages and what that means for our hybrid analog-digital future. The frequency is still there, waiting. You just have to know how to tune in. I hope you enjoyed this article. Reflect and share it with your fellow humans. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Marco's Musing on Society and Technology newsletter on LinkedIn. New transmissions are always incoming. You're listening to this through the Redefining Society and Technology podcast, so while you're here, make sure to follow the show and join us as we continue exploring life in this hybrid analog digital society. End of transmission.